They'd been together for more than 20 years, but it all came to a close in just 12 minutes. That's how long it took for lawyers representing Mick Jagger and Jerry Hall to meet a High Court judge in London and deliver an end to the affair.
She spent 23 years loving him. She spent decades staying quiet about what it actually cost her. Now, at 70 years old, Jerry Hall has finally said out loud what she never said publicly while it was happening. Behind the red carpets and the glamorous photographs with Mick Jagger stood a woman who endured infidelity, humiliation, and a marriage that legally never even existed. What she has now revealed about those years explains far more than tabloids ever managed to guess. And it starts with a discovery she made through nothing more than a bedroom mirror. The discovery that changed everything. Jerry Hall was at home not looking for trouble when she caught sight of something reflected in a mirror that she was never supposed to see. Intimate messages, exchanged between her partner and another woman, appeared right there in front of her, impossible to unsee once she'd noticed them. This wasn't some vague rumor whispered by a tabloid. This was direct, physical proof, sitting in her own house. The timing made it worse. She had just given birth to their daughter, Georgia May Jagger, and was still adjusting to life with a newborn when she learned that Mick Jagger had traveled to Thailand for a vacation with a young model named Carla Bruni, the woman who would later become the First Lady of France. For a woman who had just gone through childbirth, discovering evidence of an affair through a mirror reflection was not just painful. It was disorienting, the kind of moment that reframes everything a person thought they understood about their own relationship. She didn't storm out, she didn't call the press. Instead, by her own later account, she tried to hold the family together, continuing to present a composed public image for the sake of their children, while privately confronting a man who denied every accusation she raised. She began noticing things she couldn't explain away. Unfamiliar belongings turning up near their bed. Jagger brushing off her suspicions each time, insisting nothing was wrong. For a woman managing young children and an increasingly demanding public profile, doing that kind of emotional math quietly, night after night, took a toll most fans watching from the outside never saw. What made it even harder to process was the pattern underneath it. This wasn't a single mistake. It was one incident in what would become a long, repeating cycle, and she was only beginning to understand how deep that cycle actually ran. Not long after, the family welcomed another child, a son named Gabriel Jagger, born in England. A new baby arriving should have offered a fresh start. Instead, the arguments over Jagger's behavior kept resurfacing, the same tension resetting itself every time it seemed like things had settled. And what came next would push Jerry Hall from private suspicion into a decision she could no longer avoid making in public. The pregnancy that forced her hand. During a Rolling Stones tour through Brazil, Mick Jagger began a relationship with a model named Luciana Gimenez Morad. For a while, it stayed exactly what so many of his past entanglements had stayed. Something Jerry Hall found out about, absorbed, and quietly worked around. This time was different. Word reached her, not from Jagger himself, but through media reports, that Luciana Gimenez Morad was pregnant. Read that sequence again. She learned her partner had fathered another child with someone else, not from a private conversation, but from the same media coverage everyone else was reading. That detail alone tells you how far the relationship had drifted from anything resembling honesty. When the child, a son named Lucas Jagger, was born in 1999, there was no more room for ambiguity. Paternity tests eventually confirmed what the pregnancy announcement had already all but proven, delivered to Jagger while he was celebrating his own birthday at his estate in France, with British newspapers reporting that his own legal team informed him of the DNA match just as the news was breaking publicly. By this point, Jerry Hall was 43 years old, and their 4 children ranged from teenagers down to a 1-year-old, meaning she wasn't simply managing her own heartbreak. She was managing it while raising a household that included a newborn half-sibling situation playing out across international headlines. For Jerry Hall, this was the moment 2 decades of tolerance finally reached its limit. She filed for divorce, formally citing adultery as her grounds, and demanding roughly £30 million, then equivalent to around $37 million, from a fortune Jagger's own team estimated at somewhere near £150 million at the time. That number alone signaled how seriously she intended to fight this time. A sharp departure from the quiet endurance that had defined so much of the relationship until then. It ended a relationship that had produced 4 children and had, in the public's eyes at least, looked like one of the most enviable partnerships in entertainment. Behind that public image sat 22 years of a woman managing her partner's infidelity, largely on her own, with the world only ever seeing the version she chose to present at galas and premieres. Filing for divorce should have been the hardest part. It wasn't. What came next would strip away something Jerry Hall had believed was hers for over a decade, and it would come from the very person she was trying to leave. The marriage that legally never happened. Here's where the story turns from painful to almost unbelievable. When Jerry Hall's legal team moved forward with the divorce, Mick Jagger's lawyers responded with an argument that stunned her. Their Hindu wedding ceremony, held in 1990 on the island of Bali, had never been legally registered, they claimed, either under Indonesian law or British law. As far as the law was concerned, they said, Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger had never actually been married at all. Think about what that meant for a woman who had spent more than a decade of her life and given birth to 2 of her 4 children, believing she was someone's wife. The ceremony had felt real. The commitment had felt real. Now, facing a courtroom, she was being told that none of it carried any legal weight whatsoever, a technicality being used specifically to limit what she could claim financially from a relationship she had given 23 years of her life to. Jagger's legal argument centered on a very specific gap. His representatives pointed out that while the Hindu ceremony had been performed with full ritual and family presence, the civil registration required to make a marriage legally binding under Indonesian law had never actually been completed. Under British law, that meant the marriage carried no more legal weight than an unregistered private commitment ceremony, regardless of how many years the couple had spent presenting themselves publicly as husband and wife. For Jerry Hall, watching a 14-year commitment get reduced to a paperwork technicality in a courtroom was its own distinct injury layered on top of the infidelity that had brought her there in the first place. The case moved to London's High Court, where judges were asked to formally rule on whether the marriage had ever existed in the eyes of the law. In the end, the court sided with Jagger's argument. The marriage was officially annulled rather than dissolved through a standard divorce, a distinction that mattered enormously, both symbolically and financially. An annulment doesn't end a marriage. It declares that the marriage never legally existed in the first place. Rather than dragging the case through a prolonged public trial, both sides eventually reached a private financial settlement, with figures reported by various outlets ranging between roughly $15 million and $25 million, a steep reduction from the $37 million Hall had originally sought. As part of the arrangement, Jerry Hall retained ownership of Down House, their family home in Richmond, along with funds designated to support raising their 4 children. It closed a chapter that had lasted more than 2 decades. It also left her holding something the courtroom couldn't take away: proof that the loyalty she'd shown for 23 years had never been treated by the legal system as a real marriage at all. Rebuilding a life she didn't expect to need. Walking away from a courtroom with a settlement doesn't undo 2 decades of history. Jerry Hall packed up her belongings and began life as a single mother at her home in Richmond, raising 4 children largely on her own for the first time. The legal battle had technically ended. The emotional weight of it clearly hadn't, not immediately. What she did next surprised people who assumed her identity had always revolved entirely around Mick Jagger. She returned to acting, taking on a striking role in a West End production of The Graduate, a part that required her to perform a brief, tasteful nude scene each night, generating its own wave of press coverage and box office curiosity, independent of anything connected to Jagger. It was a deliberate reclaiming of a career she had built long before her relationship with Jagger ever began. Before she'd ever met him, Jerry Hall had already established herself as one of the most sought-after faces in fashion, working campaigns for houses like Chanel, Dior, and Versace, and appearing on countless magazine covers throughout the 1970s. Stepping back into acting in her 50s was, in many ways, a return to an identity that existed entirely independent of her 23 years beside Jagger, one she'd quietly set aside while raising 4 children. She used the years that followed to rebuild her own sense of self, separate from a partnership that had defined how the public saw her for more than 2 decades. She eventually opened her heart again, marrying media billionaire Rupert Murdoch in March of 2016 at Spencer House in London, a ceremony that drew massive international attention in its own right, and made her, at 59, a first-time bride despite decades of prior public relationships. It was Murdoch's 4th marriage. For a while, it looked like she had genuinely found stability after everything that came before, with the couple appearing regularly together at high-profile events over the following years. Then, after 6 years together, Murdoch informed her that he wanted to end their marriage, reportedly through nothing more personal than an email, telling her he had too much left to do with his remaining time to continue the relationship. For a woman who had already survived one devastating end to a long relationship, having a second marriage collapse through something as impersonal as an email must have landed as its own particular kind of blow. Friends described her at the time as heartbroken and genuinely blindsided by how abruptly it happened. She and Murdoch eventually finalized their own private financial settlement, citing irreconcilable differences rather than any public scandal. And Hall chose to step back from public entanglements altogether, settling into a quieter life at an estate in Oxfordshire, dedicating her time increasingly to her children and, eventually, to her grandchildren. 2 marriages, both ending in ways that stripped away the fairy tale versions the public had been shown. But while Jerry Hall was rebuilding her life away from cameras, Mick Jagger's own personal world was about to be struck by a tragedy that had nothing to do with her at all. A loss that reshaped everything for him. In 2001, Mick Jagger publicly confirmed a relationship with fashion designer Ren Scott, a partnership that would go on to become his longest since his years with Jerry Hall. Scott, an American designer known for sharp, tailored silhouettes favored by celebrities on red carpets worldwide, accompanied him through major public events for over a decade, and her fashion label received meaningful support and visibility through her connection to one of the most famous musicians alive, including collaborations that expanded her reach into more accessible retail lines. Their relationship unfolded largely outside the kind of tabloid warfare that had defined Jagger's years with Jerry Hall. By most accounts, it was quieter, steadier, built more around shared professional circles than the public spectacle of his earlier romances. Scott's design work continued growing throughout their years together, and she became a recognizable figure in her own right within the fashion industry. Independent of her relationship with Jagger, even as her business reportedly carried significant financial strain behind the scenes that few outside her closest circle fully understood. Then, in March of 2014, everything changed without warning. Loren Scott was found dead in her New York City apartment, reportedly amid severe financial strain she had been quietly struggling with for some time. It is a genuinely sensitive loss, and the details that matter here are simply the impact it had, not anything beyond what has already been made public. The loss sent Mick Jagger into what those close to him described as genuine emotional devastation. He postponed the Rolling Stones' entire touring schedule across Australia and New Zealand, stepping away from the stage entirely to focus on funeral arrangements for a partner he had spent over a decade building a life alongside, canceling shows that had already sold out well in advance. For a man whose name had become almost synonymous with infidelity and emotional distance in relationships, watching him respond to this kind of loss revealed something the public rarely got to see: genuine, visible grief. The kind that doesn't fit neatly into the narrative Jerry Hall's story might suggest about who he was as a partner. It doesn't erase what Jerry Hall endured. It does complicate the picture, adding a layer of loss and vulnerability to a man whose pattern with women had, until that point, looked almost entirely self-serving from the outside. Later that same year, he began a relationship with ballet dancer Melanie Hamrick, 44 years his junior, a pairing that immediately drew international attention because of the age gap alone. The couple would go on to have a son together, Devereaux Jagger, born in December of 2016, making Jagger a father for the 8th time at the age of 73. His personal life, it turned out, was far from finished evolving. And neither, remarkably, was his relationship with the woman he had once fought in court to prove he was never legally married to. What 70 years finally taught her to say. Decades after the annulment, after 2 more marriages between them ended, after a shared history of grief and rebuilding on both sides, something unexpected happened. Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger began showing up in public together again, not as feuding exes avoiding eye contact, but as 2 people who had clearly found their way to something resembling peace. At events like the British Museum Ball, they were photographed together warmly, posing for pictures alongside their daughter Elizabeth Jagger, projecting an ease that would have seemed impossible during the bitter years of their legal fight. That warmth extends well beyond staged photo opportunities. The 2 now regularly attend family gatherings together, including large Christmas celebrations that bring together all of Jagger's children and their respective mothers under one roof, an arrangement Hall herself has described as genuinely enjoyable, rather than merely tolerated for appearances. It's a striking evolution for a relationship that once required a high court judge to formally rule on whether their marriage had legally existed at all. Around the same period, Jagger's own career entered a fresh chapter as well, with the Rolling Stones releasing the album Hackney Diamonds and launching a major world tour. Proof that the man at the center of this entire story remained, even in his 80s, unwilling to slow down. As Jerry Hall approached her 70th year, she gave a series of candid interviews to major publications including British Vogue and Hello, finally reflecting openly on the relationship that had shaped so much of her adult life. She spoke about accepting the natural signs of aging, rejecting cosmetic intervention entirely, and finding contentment in a quieter, more grounded version of herself. When asked to look back on Jagger specifically, her tone wasn't bitter. She described choosing, now, to focus mainly on the good memories, acknowledging that countless women had wanted his attention simply because of who he was, and admitting that while the pain of his infidelity had been real at the time, she had come to see the entire arc of their relationship as having unfolded exactly the way it needed to. That reflection matters because of who is delivering it. This isn't a young woman still hoping to win back a partner's loyalty. This is a 70-year-old grandmother who spent 23 years absorbing infidelity, fought and lost a legal battle over whether her own marriage even counted, rebuilt her identity twice afterward, and still, decades later, chose forgiveness over resentment. Her present life reflects that choice directly. She spends her time at her family estate in Oxfordshire surrounded by 3 grandchildren, hosting an unusual but genuinely warm blended family that includes Jagger, Melanie Hamrick, their young son, and Luciana Morad's son, Lucas, all gathering for meals together, setting aside a history that once looked irreparable. The real story here was never simply about a marriage that legally never existed, or a settlement number, or even the infidelity itself. It was about what a woman does with decades of quiet endurance, once she finally reaches the other side of it. Jerry Hall didn't just survive Mick Jagger's version of loyalty. She outlasted it, rebuilt around it twice, and ultimately decided that peace was worth more to her than staying angry about a past she could no longer change. Knowing everything she endured and everything she still chose to forgive. Do you think Jerry Hall made the right choice by finding peace with Mick Jagger instead of walking away for good? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.